On the night of June 7th, 1867, at Sacred Heart Plantation in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, a 34-year-old enslaved woman named Dinah set fire to the plantation chapel during mandatory evening worship, killing 23 people, including Reverend Cornelius Whitfield, his wife Magnolia, 4 overseers, 2 visiting slave traders, and 14 white clients who frequented the secret basement where enslaved girls aged 12 to 16 were systematically raped under the guise of spiritual purification. Dinah chained every exit with locks stolen from the blacksmith shop over 3 months, distributed lamp oil throughout the building for weeks, and ignited the blaze during Sunday night sermon, standing outside to ensure no one escaped. The fire was so intense that the wooden chapel collapsed in 17 minutes, and the screams could be heard 3 miles away. The temperature inside reached over 1,000 degrees. Bodies were found melted together, indistinguishable from the charred pews. But this story of absolute vengeance began 2 years earlier, when Dinah's 14-year-old daughter Rose was taken to the chapel basement for the first time and never came back the same. Sacred Heart Plantation sat on 4,200 acres of prime sugarcane land along Bayou Teche, just outside the town of St. Martinville. The plantation had been in the Whitfield family since 1798, passed down through 3 generations of men who wore their Christianity like armor and wielded it like a weapon. By 1867, 2 years after the official end of slavery, Reverend Cornelius Whitfield had found a loophole that kept his operation running exactly as it had before the 13th Amendment. He called it spiritual rehabilitation for the formerly enslaved and charged the federal government for housing, feeding, and educating freed people who had nowhere else to go. In reality, Sacred Heart remained a plantation in everything but name, with 217 black souls trapped in a system that had simply changed its vocabulary from slavery to apprenticeship, from ownership to stewardship, from master to benefactor. The plantation's centerpiece was a magnificent white chapel built in 1841, complete with a towering steeple visible for miles, stained glass windows imported from France, and hand-carved pews of Louisiana cypress. Reverend Whitfield preached there every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening. His sermons broadcast to the entire parish through a network of believers who considered him the most devout man in southern Louisiana. What they didn't know was that beneath the chapel's polished floors lay a basement divided into 6 small rooms, each containing nothing but a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a Bible open to passages about obedience and submission. This was where Reverend Whitfield conducted his other ministry, the one that generated more income than all 4,000 acres of sugar cane combined. Dinah had arrived at Sacred Heart in 1853 as a young woman of 20, purchased at the New Orleans slave market, along with her husband Samuel and their infant daughter Rose. She had been born on a rice plantation in South Carolina, sold away from her parents at age 15, and spent 5 years in Georgia before being transported to Louisiana. Dinah possessed a skill that made her valuable beyond fieldwork. She could read and write, taught secretly by an elderly house slave who had learned from a sympathetic master's daughter decades before. This literacy remained Dinah's most closely guarded secret, one that would eventually become instrumental in her vengeance. Her official role at Sacred Heart was head cook, responsible for feeding both the big house and the 200 field workers twice daily. This position gave her access to every building on the plantation, knowledge of every schedule and routine, and most importantly, trust. Dinah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany, high cheekbones that spoke of her grandmother's Igbo heritage, and eyes that seemed to see through pretense and deception. Her hands were strong from decades of labor, scarred from countless kitchen burns and cuts, capable of both tenderness and terrible violence. She wore her hair wrapped in bright tignon head wraps that she dyed herself using indigo and madder root, a small assertion of beauty and identity in a world designed to strip both away. She moved with quiet efficiency, speaking only when necessary, observing everything. Other enslaved people at Sacred Heart knew Dinah as steady, reliable, deeply protective of her family, and possessed of a core of strength that even the worst brutality could not break. Her husband Samuel worked as the plantation blacksmith, a position of relative privilege that nonetheless required him to forge the very chains and shackles used to control his people. He was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging a hammer, and hands that could shape iron with precision and artistry. Samuel had proposed to Dinah during their second week at Sacred Heart, a quiet ceremony conducted by the elderly conjure woman, Mama Bessie, under a full moon, with no legal standing but complete spiritual validity. They had shared a small cabin near the blacksmith shop for 14 years, raising Rose with as much love and protection as slavery allowed, teaching her to read in secret, filling her with stories of African ancestors who had been kings and queens, warriors and healers. Rose had grown into a beautiful girl, tall and graceful like her father, with her mother's intelligent eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest quarters. By age 14, she had developed the curves of womanhood, which made her a target in a place where black girls' bodies were never their own. Dinah had watched her daughter with increasing anxiety as Rose matured, knowing what awaited girls who caught white men's attention on plantations. She had warned Rose to walk with eyes down, to make herself small and invisible, to never be alone near white men. But at Sacred Heart, there was a predator who operated under divine protection, and no amount of caution could save Rose from his attention. Reverend Cornelius Whitfield was 58 years old in 1867, a tall man with silver hair worn long in the style of Old Testament prophets, pale blue eyes that could shift from benevolent warmth to icy cruelty in seconds, and a voice that boomed with theatrical authority during sermons. He wore only black suits of the finest wool, white shirts with starched collars, and a golden cross that hung heavy on his chest. Whitfield had inherited Sacred Heart at age 30 from his father, along with 143 enslaved people and a thriving sugar operation. He had built the chapel with profits from his first harvest, married Magnolia Beaumont from a neighboring plantation family, and established himself as a pillar of the community through generous donations to missionary societies and passionate advocacy for the spiritual salvation of enslaved Africans. But Cornelius Whitfield harbored appetites that contradicted every word he preached. He believed, with absolute conviction, that his desires were divinely ordained, that his position as a white man of God gave him rights over black flesh that superseded human law. He had begun his basement ministry in 1845, starting with adult enslaved women who could be coerced or threatened into silence. Over the years, his preferences shifted toward younger and younger girls, and he developed an elaborate theology to justify his predation. He preached that black girls needed to be broken of their sinful nature through submission to white authority, that their bodies were vessels for purification, that his acts were holy sacraments that prepared them for proper Christian womanhood. He recorded these teachings in journals kept locked in his study, page after page of twisted scripture twisted to excuse the inexcusable. The Reverend was not alone in his depravity. His wife Magnolia, a thin woman of 52 with graying blonde hair, always arranged in elaborate curls, served as the chapel's organist and her husband's most devoted accomplice. She selected the girls, prepared them with baths and white dresses that mimicked communion gowns, and delivered them to the basement rooms. Magnolia told herself she was saving these girls from worse fates, that her husband's attention was a blessing compared to the brutal lust of overseers and field workers, that she was performing Christian charity. She kept meticulous records of each girl's visits, noting dates and duration with the precision of a bookkeeper, maintaining an archive of abuse disguised as ministry logs. The operation expanded significantly after the war ended. With slavery officially abolished, but the social order largely unchanged, Reverend Whitfield discovered he could generate substantial income by opening his basement ministry to other white men. Plantation owners from neighboring parishes, merchants from St. Martinville, even Union soldiers stationed nearby for Reconstruction, all were welcomed as paying guests at evening services that concluded with access to the girls downstairs. Whitfield charged $20 per visit, a fortune in 1867, and operated 3 nights per week. Wednesday nights were reserved for his personal use. Sunday and Friday nights were open to clients. The money funded his public charitable work, creating a perfect circle of righteousness built on systematic rape. 4 overseers enforced discipline at Sacred Heart and helped maintain the chapel's secrets. The head overseer, Dutch McLean, was a massive red-haired man from Tennessee who had served in the Confederate Army and returned home to find his preferred profession, brutalizing black people, officially outlawed but practically unchanged. He carried a whip called Sweet Molly that he had braided himself from bullhide, and he used it liberally on anyone who stepped out of line or failed to meet their daily quota. McLean knew about the basement and personally delivered girls who resisted, holding them down when necessary, considering it part of his job to maintain order. He was 43 years old, illiterate but cunning, motivated by a bone-deep hatred that needed no justification beyond skin color. The second overseer, James Pike, was younger at 28, a wiry man with a perpetual sneer and a talent for psychological torture. Pike preferred breaking spirits to breaking bodies, though he did plenty of both. He had been born poor white in Mississippi, and saw his position at Sacred Heart as a step up in the world, proof that even the lowest white man stood above the highest black person. Pike took particular pleasure in forcing enslaved fathers to watch their daughters taken to the chapel, in making mothers choose which child would go, in creating no-win situations that destroyed families from within. He kept a record book of every humiliation he engineered, reviewing it on slow days for entertainment. The third overseer, Benjamin Stone, was the quietest and perhaps the cruelest. Stone was 35, a former school teacher from Virginia who had lost his position due to excessive drinking and drifted south looking for work that didn't require sobriety. He brought an educated man's precision to violence, calculating exactly how much pain a body could endure without dying, experimenting with different methods of punishment as if conducting scientific research. Stone particularly enjoyed the basement ministry because it allowed him to observe psychological breaking in real time. He took notes afterward, filling journals with observations about trauma and submission that he imagined might someday be published as scholarly work on the Negro temperament. The fourth overseer, Thomas Root, was the youngest at 24. A Louisiana native who had grown up on a neighboring plantation and knew no other life. Root was not naturally cruel, but he was ambitious and completely amoral, willing to do whatever advanced his position. He saw the basement ministry as a business opportunity and suggested to Reverend Whitfield that they could expand operations, perhaps even establish similar chapels on other plantations for a franchise fee. Root kept the financial records, tracking income and expenses with meticulous attention, treating rape as a profit center requiring optimization. These men formed the inner circle of Sacred Heart's operation, but they were supported by a larger network. 2 slave traders, Martin Jessup and Cole Barnaby, regularly visited the plantation to supply new girls when the current ones aged out or broke down. Jessup and Barnaby operated throughout southern Louisiana, buying young girls from desperate families during Reconstruction, promising education or domestic work, then selling them to operations like Sacred Heart. They received a finder's fee for each girl, plus a percentage of the first year's profits she generated. Both men were in their 40s, partners in business and depravity, equally responsible for the systematic destruction of childhood innocence across 3 parishes. The regular clients formed a rotating cast of the parish's most respected white men. They included Judge Harrison Webb, who sentenced black defendants by day and assaulted black girls by night; Dr. Samuel Finch, who treated plantation families and certified girls as healthy enough for use; Merchant Robert Landry, who sold dry goods to the community and bought human flesh for his pleasure; Captain Edward Morrison, a Union officer whose job was to protect freed people but who instead exploited them; Pastor John Hebert from a neighboring parish, who preached against sin while committing the worst of crimes; Lawyer Daniel Cross, Sheriff William Tate, Banker George Hammond, and 6 others whose names Dinah memorized from papers carelessly left in the chapel office where she sometimes cleaned. For 14 years, Dinah had endured Sacred Heart by focusing on 3 things: survival, resistance where possible, and protecting Rose at all costs. She fed her family better than most by skimming from the big house kitchen. She taught Rose to read using a Bible she had stolen, page by page over years, reassembling it in secret. She participated in the Hush Harbor meetings deep in the cane fields, where Mama Bessie led them in spirituals that carried coded messages of hope and resistance. She practiced hoodoo, passed down from her grandmother, keeping protective mojo bags for her family, knowing it was as much about maintaining cultural identity as actual magic. She survived by creating a life within slavery, carving out moments of humanity in an inhuman system. But Dinah's world shattered on a Wednesday night in April of 1865, just weeks after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, when the war was over. But nothing had really changed at Sacred Heart. That night, Magnolia Whitfield came to Dinah's cabin while she was preparing supper. The mistress wore a blue silk dress despite the evening hour and carried her ever-present Bible with ribbon markers at selected passages. She smiled with brittle pleasantness and said, "Dinah, the Reverend has selected Rose for special instruction in Christian womanhood. She is to come to the chapel tonight at 8 o'clock. Bathe her and dress her in white. This is a great honor for your family." Dinah's blood turned to ice. She had heard whispers about the chapel basement, fragments of horror shared in the quarters late at night when darkness made truth possible. She knew that girls went into that basement and came out changed, hollowed, broken in ways that never healed. She knew that some girls never came out at all, disappearing into the night, sold away when they became inconvenient. She knew, though she had never spoken it aloud, that Sacred Heart's chapel was not a house of God, but a house of demons wearing holy robes. Dinah dropped to her knees in front of Magnolia, something she had never done in 14 years, abandoning all pride. "Please, mistress, she's only 14. She's a good girl. She works hard. Don't take her. Take me instead. I'll do anything. Please." The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw, a mother's plea that transcended any calculation or dignity. Dinah grasped Magnolia's skirt, tears streaming down her face, begging with every fiber of her being for mercy she knew would not come. Magnolia's expression never changed. She pulled her skirt free with distaste and said in a voice like glass, "Your daughter has been chosen for the Lord's work, Dinah. To refuse would be to refuse God himself. 8 o'clock. Do not be late. And Dinah, if you speak of this to anyone, if you attempt to hide the girl or flee, Dutch will whip Samuel to death in front of the entire plantation. Do you understand?" Dinah understood. She understood that evil wore many faces, that some of the worst monsters quoted scripture, that the law offered no protection, and God seemed deaf to prayers. She understood that she had no power, no rights, no recourse. She understood that her daughter would be taken to that basement and violated by a man who called himself Reverend, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She understood that if she tried to save Rose, Samuel would die. She understood that the choice was no choice at all, just different versions of unbearable loss. That night, Dinah bathed her daughter with trembling hands, watching Rose's innocent confusion turn to dawning horror as she realized what was about to happen. Rose had heard the whispers too. She knew what the chapel basement meant. She cried and clung to her mother, begging not to go, and Dinah held her and lied with a breaking heart, saying it would be all right, saying be strong, saying she would survive this, saying all the empty promises mothers tell their children when the world is about to destroy them. Samuel stood in the corner of their cabin, with tears running down his face, hands clenched into fists that could do nothing. A powerful man, rendered utterly powerless by a system designed to break him. At 8 o'clock, Dinah walked Rose to the chapel herself, holding her daughter's hand as they crossed the dark plantation grounds. The chapel glowed with lamplight, its white walls luminous in the darkness, looking exactly like what it pretended to be, a sanctuary, a holy place, somewhere safe. The door stood open. Magnolia waited inside with her brittle smile, holding a white dress that looked like it belonged at a first communion. Reverend Whitfield stood at the altar, his silver hair catching the light, his expression serene and benevolent, looking for all the world like a man of God. Dinah handed her daughter over and walked back into the night. She made it halfway across the yard before she collapsed, vomiting into the dirt, her body rejecting the horror her mind could not process. She knelt there in the darkness, listening to spirituals drifting from the quarters, thinking about her grandmother's stories of warriors who never surrendered, thinking about the Underground Railroad that had carried thousands to freedom, thinking about Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and all the rebels who chose death over submission. She thought about poison and fire, about knives and vengeance, about all the ways a powerless woman might still inflict pain on those who hurt her child. And in that moment, kneeling in the dirt outside the chapel where her daughter was being raped, Dinah made a promise to herself and to every ancestor whose blood ran in her veins. They would pay. Every single one of them would pay. She would make them pay. Rose came home 3 hours later, walking stiffly, silent, her white dress torn and stained. She would not speak, would not eat, would not meet her parents' eyes. She crawled into bed and turned her face to the wall. For 2 days, she remained like that, unreachable, locked inside a place where neither love nor comfort could penetrate. On the 3rd day, she began to speak again, but she was different. The light had gone out of her eyes. The smile that could brighten any room never returned. Rose had survived, but the girl she had been was gone, murdered in that basement as surely as if Reverend Whitfield had put a bullet in her head, and it did not stop. Wednesday after Wednesday, Magnolia came to collect Rose for what she called continuing instruction. Sometimes Rose was gone for 1 hour, sometimes for 4. She never spoke about what happened in that basement. She did not need to. Her eyes told the story. Her nightmares told the story. The way she flinched at sudden movements told the story. The way she scrubbed her skin raw every night told the story. The way she stopped singing told the story louder than words ever could. Dinah watched her daughter die by inches and felt something inside herself transform. The part of her that had believed in eventual justice, in the possibility of mercy, in the idea that goodness might ultimately prevail, that part withered and died. What grew in its place was cold and hard and patient, a hatred so pure it became almost peaceful, a determination so absolute it felt like destiny. Dinah began to observe everything with new eyes, not as a slave trying to survive, but as a general planning a campaign. She noted schedules, mapped the plantation, identified vulnerabilities, and studied her enemies with the focus of a predator selecting prey. She learned that Reverend Whitfield kept detailed journals in his locked study, journals that would condemn him if they ever saw daylight. She learned that Magnolia maintained the client list in a ledger hidden behind a loose board in the chapel sacristy. She learned that the basement had only one entrance, accessed through a trapdoor behind the altar. She learned that Dutch McLean always drank himself stupid on Friday nights and slept in the barn. She learned that the chapel was built entirely of pine wood, old and dry and perfect for burning. She learned that lamp oil was stored in quantity in the chapel's storage room, ostensibly for the many lamps required for evening services. Most importantly, Dinah learned patience. She did not act rashly or in sudden rage. She knew that vengeance executed poorly would accomplish nothing but her own death and leave Rose orphaned and vulnerable. She knew she had to be strategic, methodical, and absolutely certain. She began to plan not just for revenge, but for justice. Not just for punishment, but for complete annihilation of the system that had destroyed her daughter. If she was going to strike, she would strike in a way that destroyed them all, every single man who participated in this evil, and she would make sure the world knew why. You might be wondering how a mother survives this. How do you watch your child suffer and not lose your mind? The answer is that Dinah did not survive unchanged. Part of her did lose her mind, the part that believed in humanity and goodness and God. That part died. What remained was something harder and colder, something that could look at mass murder and call it justice, something that could plan systematic execution and call it righteousness. Dinah became a weapon, and she honed herself with the patience of someone who knew that vengeance delayed was not vengeance denied, just vengeance perfected. For 2 years, Dinah prepared. She stole small amounts of lamp oil from the chapel storage room every week, storing it in sealed bottles hidden in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. She took 1 bottle per week, never enough to be noticed, accumulating gallons over months. She identified every entrance and exit to the chapel, noting which doors swung which way, which windows could be opened, where someone might try to escape. She studied the layout of the basement through careful questions to Magnolia about cleaning, learning that it had 6 small rooms, all opening onto a central corridor, with the entrance at one end and no other way out, a perfect trap. She observed the client schedule and identified Wednesday and Friday nights as the primary operation nights, with Sunday nights occasionally used for special clients. She noted that the regular clients numbered 14 men, all of them respected in the community, all of them convinced of their complete immunity from consequences. She memorized their faces and names: Judge Webb, with his politician smile, Dr. Finch with his kind bedside manner, Merchant Landry with his Sunday church attendance, all of them monsters in gentleman's clothing. Dinah studied the overseers with equal attention. She learned that Dutch McLean had a weakness for corn whiskey and would drink anything offered to him. She learned that James Pike was vain about his appearance and carried a pocket watch he checked constantly. She learned that Benjamin Stone kept journals about his experiments in the overseers' quarters. She learned that Thomas Root was a coward beneath his ambition and could be relied upon to run when danger appeared rather than fight. She befriended the plantation blacksmith who worked alongside Samuel and convinced him to teach her about locks and chains. She claimed she wanted to understand her husband's work better, and the old man, lonely for conversation, showed her how different locks worked, which were strongest, how chains could be secured so they could not be easily broken. Dinah listened and learned and smiled sweetly, never revealing that she was gathering knowledge for mass murder. She cultivated Magnolia's trust by being the perfect servant, anticipating needs before they were spoken, preparing favorite dishes without being asked, offering to clean the chapel to save Magnolia the trouble. The mistress began to rely on Dinah's efficiency and allowed her more access to the chapel, even giving her a key to the storage room so she could polish the silver candlesticks and maintain the altar cloths. Dinah accepted this trust while imagining Magnolia burning alive, and she never let the hatred show on her face. During this time, Dinah also began to practice hoodoo more seriously under Mama Bessie's instruction. The old conjure woman had been born in Haiti and brought to Louisiana as a young woman, carrying with her a deep knowledge of African spiritual practices mixed with Catholicism and indigenous traditions. Mama Bessie taught Dinah how to make grisgris bags for protection, how to call on the lower for guidance, how to use herbs and roots for various purposes. More importantly, she taught Dinah that vengeance could be sacred, that there were spirits who approved of righteous anger, that sometimes the only way to cleanse evil was to burn it completely away. Mama Bessie never explicitly said she supported what Dinah was planning, but she gave her the tools anyway. She showed her how to create a mojo bag for courage that Dinah wore hidden against her skin. She taught her prayers to Papa Legba, opener of gates and crossroads guardian, asking him to open the path to justice. She shared stories of the Haitian Revolution, of enslaved people who rose up and slaughtered their masters and created a free black nation, proving that the impossible could be achieved through courage and blood. These lessons sustained Dinah through 2 years of watching Rose fade, giving her the spiritual strength to match her growing practical knowledge. Samuel knew something was changing in his wife, but did not ask questions. He saw the way she looked at Reverend Whitfield, saw the coldness in her eyes when Magnolia appeared, saw how she studied the chapel like a general studying a fortress. He knew his wife was planning something terrible and necessary, and he made the decision to trust her completely. When she asked him to forge a dozen heavy chains with locks and deliver them secretly to her over the course of months, he did so without question. When she asked him to create a key that would fit the chapel's main door lock, he made one and gave it to her wrapped in cloth. Samuel understood that his role was to support whatever Dinah decided, to be the foundation upon which her vengeance would rest. The turning point came in May of 1867, when Rose attempted to kill herself by drinking lye water from the laundry. Dinah found her daughter convulsing in their cabin, foam on her lips, eyes rolling back. She forced her to vomit, poured milk down her throat to neutralize the poison, held her through hours of agony as her body fought between life and death. Rose survived, but the message was clear. She could not endure much longer. The basement had broken her so completely that death seemed preferable to another Wednesday night. That same week, Dinah learned from overheard conversation that a new girl was being brought in from New Orleans, a 12-year-old whose mother had sold her, believing she was going to domestic service. Rose would likely be phased out, sold away, or simply discarded like used goods. Dinah realized she was running out of time. If she waited much longer, Rose would succeed in dying, or would be sold, or would simply vanish one night the way inconvenient girls tended to vanish from Sacred Heart. The time for preparation was ending. The time for action had arrived. Dinah chose June 7th for specific reasons. It was a Wednesday night, which meant Reverend Whitfield would be in the basement personally rather than with clients. It was 2 weeks after a new moon, providing maximum darkness for her preparations. The weather forecast called for dry conditions and southern winds that would carry fire quickly. Most importantly, there would be a special service that night marking the anniversary of the chapel's dedication 26 years earlier, which meant extended prayers and hymns that would keep everyone in the building longer than usual, giving her more time to secure the exits. The plan was simple in concept, but required precise execution. During the afternoon, while cleaning the chapel as usual, Dinah would distribute the accumulated lamp oil throughout the building, focusing on the wooden support beams and the areas near each exit. She would unlock several windows from the inside, but wedge them shut, so they appeared closed while actually being impossible to open quickly. She would position the heavy chains near each door, hidden behind curtains and furniture, ready to be deployed. She would verify that the basement trapdoor could be locked from above. She had tested it months ago and knew it could be secured with a simple iron bar. That evening, she would attend the service as required, All freed people were expected to attend chapel weekly as part of their continuing spiritual rehabilitation. During the service, she would slip out as if using the privy, a common enough occurrence that no one would question it. Once outside, she would systematically chain every exit, working quickly and quietly, using the chains Samuel had made and the locks she had practiced with for months. With everyone trapped inside, she would return to the storage room through the window she had left unlocked for herself, retrieve the remaining lamp oil, and saturate the building's exterior. Finally, she would light the fire simultaneously at multiple points, creating an inferno that would consume the chapel in minutes. She knew she would likely die. There would be no hiding her involvement, no plausible escape. The punishment for such an act would be torture, followed by execution. But Dinah had made peace with death 2 years earlier when Rose first went to that basement. She had nothing left to lose except her daughter's life, and that was something Rose no longer wanted. Dinah's goal was not survival, but justice, not escape, but annihilation. If she could take every person responsible for Rose's suffering down into hell with her, she would die satisfied. The night before the fire, Dinah prepared herself spiritually. She bathed in water mixed with blessed salt and protective herbs according to Mama Bessie's instructions. She prayed to her ancestors, calling them by name, asking them to guide her hand and accept her into their company when her work was done. She created a final gree-gree bag containing graveyard dirt, sulfur, and a piece of paper on which she had written the names of everyone who would die, then soaked it in her own blood drawn from a cut on her palm. This was not hoodoo for protection or blessing, but for vengeance and destruction, calling on spirits who understood righteous rage. She spent the evening with Rose and Samuel, memorizing their faces, trying to give them a final night of peace. She cooked Rose's favorite meal of red beans and rice with cornbread, foods from Rose's childhood before the basement stole her innocence. She sat with Samuel on their cabin porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, holding his hand without speaking, communicating through touch what words could not convey. She told neither of them what she planned, wanting to protect them from knowledge that could be tortured out of them afterward. Let them be surprised. Let them be innocent. Let them survive her if they could. That final night, Dinah did not sleep. She lay awake reviewing every step of her plan, identifying potential problems and solutions. What if the chains did not hold? She had tested them. They would hold. What if someone escaped through a window? She had prepared for that. All reachable windows would be wedged shut. What if rain came? She checked the sky repeatedly. It remained clear. What if her courage failed at the critical moment? She touched the gree-gree bag against her skin and felt ancestral strength flow through her. Her courage would not fail. She had waited too long and suffered too much for doubt to stop her now. As dawn broke on June 7th, 1867, Dinah rose and dressed in her best clothes, a blue cotton dress she had sewn herself and saved for special occasions. She wrapped her hair in a bright red tignon, the color of blood and fire and revolution. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror Samuel had traded for years ago, and saw not a slave, not a victim, but an instrument of justice. Today, she would either succeed and change Sacred Heart forever, or she would fail and die trying. Either outcome was acceptable. The only unacceptable outcome was doing nothing while evil continued unopposed. She prepared breakfast for her family, serving them grits and eggs and the last of the bacon from the big house kitchen. She watched Rose pick at her food, noting the dark circles under her daughter's eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she jumped at sudden sounds. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant another Wednesday had passed, which meant Rose had survived another basement session just 3 days ago. Dinah thought about what was happening to her daughter in that place and felt the cold rage that had sustained her for 2 years intensify into something almost peaceful in its absoluteness. Samuel looked at her across their rough wooden table, and his eyes asked a question. Dinah gave the slightest nod. Samuel closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them and nodded back. Whatever was about to happen, he understood and accepted it. He reached across the table and took Dinah's hand, squeezing once, hard, communicating a lifetime of love and partnership in that single gesture. Then he stood, kissed the top of Rose's head with heartbreaking tenderness, and left for the blacksmith shop without looking back. Dinah spent the morning performing her regular duties with mechanical precision, cooking meals for the big house and the field workers, cleaning the kitchen, preparing supplies for the next day. She moved through familiar tasks while her mind ran through the plan repeatedly, checking each step, each detail, each possible complication. At 1 o'clock, she walked to the chapel as usual for her weekly cleaning duties, carrying her basket of rags and polishing compounds, looking exactly as she had looked every Wednesday for 2 years. No one paid her any attention. No one suspected that the woman with the cleaning basket was about to become the most dangerous person on the plantation. The chapel stood empty in the afternoon heat, silent and still, its white walls gleaming in bright sunlight. Dinah unlocked the main door with her key and stepped inside, crossing herself as she had been taught to do, maintaining the appearance of piety even though she no longer believed any god dwelled in this place. The interior smelled of linseed oil and candle wax, and something else, something foul that she had learned to identify as the smell of evil wearing a holy mask. She walked down the center aisle between the polished cypress pews, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, approaching the altar where Reverend Whitfield would stand that evening to preach about sin and salvation and the need for obedience. Behind the altar, hidden by a velvet curtain, lay the trapdoor to the basement. Dinah had cleaned this area 100 times and knew every board and hinge. She pulled aside the curtain and looked down at the iron ring set into the wooden floor, the entrance to hell disguised as a door to a cellar. She thought about Rose descending these stairs, about all the girls who had descended these stairs, about the horrors that happened in those 6 small rooms below. She thought about the men who had used those rooms, the men who would gather there tonight, the men who believed themselves untouchable, and she smiled. Dinah began her work methodically and without hurry. She retrieved the first bottle of lamp oil from where she had hidden it weeks ago behind the organ, and began to pour it along the base of the walls, working from the front of the chapel toward the back. The oil soaked into the old pine wood readily, disappearing into grain and crack and joint. She moved to the second bottle, then the third, distributing the oil in patterns that would ensure rapid fire spread. She saturated the area around the basement trapdoor most heavily, wanting to ensure that even if someone reached the door, they would find it surrounded by flames. She moved to the windows next, checking each one carefully. Most were too high to reach without a ladder, but 4 were at ground level and represented potential escape routes. Dinah had prepared for this months ago by carefully working small wooden wedges into the window frames during routine cleaning, positioning them so the windows appeared closed normally but could not be opened without removing the wedges first. She tested each window now, confirming they were immovable, then placed furniture in front of them as additional obstacles. A desperate person might eventually break through glass and remove wedges and climb over furniture, but it would take time, and time was something she would not give them. The chains came next. Samuel had forged them according to her precise specifications, heavy links of iron, 8 feet long, with locks that required keys she had hidden in the kitchen. Dinah had smuggled these chains into the chapel 1 at a time over 3 months, concealing them behind altar cloths and organ pipes and stacked hymnals. Now she retrieved them and positioned one near each of the 3 doors, the main entrance, the side door near the pulpit, and the rear door near the storage room. She hid them under pews and behind curtains, ready to be deployed quickly once everyone was inside. The final preparation involved the basement itself. Dinah descended the narrow stairs into the underground chambers, forcing herself to enter the place where her daughter had been destroyed. The basement was divided as she had learned, 6 small rooms opening onto a central corridor, each room containing a bed and a Bible and the residue of countless violations. The smell down here was overpowering, a mixture of sweat and fear and shame that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Dinah wanted to vomit. Instead, she walked to the far end of the corridor and verified what she had discovered during a previous cleaning. There was no second exit, no window, no way out, except the stairs she had just descended. Perfect. She climbed back up, pulled the trapdoor closed, and positioned a heavy wooden beam across it that could be dropped into iron brackets she had installed months ago during a supposed repair. Once that beam dropped, the trapdoor would be sealed from above, trapping anyone in the basement with no hope of escape. Dinah tested the mechanism once, twice, 3 times, ensuring it would work smoothly when the moment came. Satisfied, she left the beam leaning against the altar where she could reach it quickly. By 4 o'clock, the chapel was ready. Every exit blocked or prepared to be blocked, every surface soaked with oil, every window sealed, the basement configured as a perfect trap. Dinah performed one final check, walking through the space with a critical eye, identifying anything she might have missed. Finding nothing, she collected her cleaning supplies, locked the main door behind her, and returned to her cabin to prepare for the evening service. She found Rose lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. "Mama, do I have to go tonight?" Rose asked in a voice like broken glass. "Can't I just stay here? Can't I just die?" Dinah sat beside her daughter and stroked her hair, fighting back tears that would serve no purpose. "Yes, baby, you have to go tonight, but I promise you, this is the last time. After tonight, no one will ever hurt you again. Do you believe me?" Rose looked at her mother with eyes that had forgotten hope, but nodded anyway. "I believe you, Mama." She did not ask what her mother meant. She did not want to know. At 7:30, the plantation bell rang, calling everyone to Wednesday evening service. Dinah dressed Rose in a simple brown dress and walked with her across the plantation grounds toward the glowing chapel. Other freed people emerged from their cabins, moving in silent groups toward the mandatory worship that none of them wanted, but all were required to attend. Samuel joined them from the blacksmith shop, taking his place beside his wife and daughter, his face unreadable. Together they walked toward the chapel, one family among dozens, looking no different than any other Wednesday night. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Sacred Heart Plantation would burn. Tonight, 23 people would die screaming. Tonight, Dinah would become something history books would struggle to categorize: terrorist, murderer, hero, liberator, monster, saint. Tonight, justice would come to Louisiana, wrapped in fire and fury, and the world would never be the same. The chapel was already half full when Dinah's family arrived. Reverend Whitfield stood at the altar in his black suit and golden cross, greeting parishioners with benevolent smiles and scriptural blessings. Magnolia played soft hymns on the organ, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced grace. The 4 overseers positioned themselves strategically around the space. Dutch McLean near the front to watch for any disturbance, James Pike by the side door to prevent unauthorized exits, Benjamin Stone near the rear monitoring the crowd, Thomas Root near the storage room protecting the valuable equipment. They performed these roles every service, maintaining order through implied threat, ensuring compliance through fear. The regular clients began arriving around 7:45, entering through the side door in small groups, greeting the Reverend quietly, moving to sit in the front pews reserved for white men. Judge Webb arrived in his finest suit, bringing with him Merchant Landry and Dr. Finch. Sheriff Tate came with Lawyer Cross. Banker Hammond entered alone, as did Captain Morrison in his Union uniform, the blue coat a bitter reminder that the North's victory had changed so little. The two slave traders, Jessup and Barnaby, arrived last, laughing about some private joke, treating the evening as a social occasion. By 8 o'clock, all 14 regular clients were present, seated in places of honor near the front, ready for worship and whatever would follow. Dinah sat in the back with Rose and Samuel, watching everything with the focused attention of a predator preparing to strike. She noted who sat where, counted heads, verified that everyone she wanted dead was present. 23 people in total. Reverend Whitfield, Magnolia, 4 overseers, 2 slave traders, 14 clients. 23 monsters wearing human faces. 23 souls about to be sent to judgment. At 8:15, Reverend Whitfield called the service to order, his voice booming through the chapel with theatrical authority. Brothers and sisters, we gather tonight to celebrate 26 years since this sacred house of worship was dedicated to the glory of God. For more than a quarter century, Sacred Heart Chapel has stood as a beacon of righteousness in these troubled times, a place where the Word of God is preached without compromise, where the lost are found, where sinners are redeemed through the transformative power of Christian discipline. The congregation responded with dutiful amens, the freed people's voices hollow and mechanical, the white men's enthusiastic and genuine. Dinah remained silent, lips pressed together, hands folded in her lap, the picture of obedient piety. Inside, she counted minutes and planned movements, visualizing each step she would take, each chain she would deploy, each door she would seal. The service followed its usual pattern: opening prayer, hymn, scripture reading, another hymn, sermon. Magnolia's organ music filled the space with sounds of false holiness, while her husband expounded on the virtues of submission and obedience. Paul tells us that slaves should obey their masters in everything, not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord, Whitfield preached, twisting scripture into chains more binding than any Samuel had forged. Even now, in these days of so-called freedom, the fundamental truth remains. The Negro race requires guidance, discipline, and correction from their white Christian benefactors. It is not cruelty but charity, not oppression but opportunity, not slavery but salvation. The white men nodded and murmured approval. The freed people sat in silence, faces carefully blank, revealing nothing of their true thoughts. Dinah listened to this poison and felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. This man, this monster in reverend's clothing, would be dead within the hour. His wife, his accomplices, his clients, all of them would burn, and she would make sure they knew why. At 9 o'clock, 1 hour into the service, Dinah stood quietly and slipped out the rear door as if going to the privy. Several other women had done the same throughout the service, so her exit attracted no attention. She walked quickly through the darkness to the side of the chapel, retrieving the first chain from where she had hidden it earlier. Working with hands that did not shake despite the enormity of what she was about to do, Dinah wrapped the chain around the handles of the side door and secured it with a lock, pulling tight to ensure no gap remained. The chain held firm. The door would not open. She moved to the rear door next, repeating the process, wrapping chain around handles and through brackets she had installed months ago during supposed repairs. Another lock clicked shut, another exit sealed. She could hear Whitfield's voice from inside, muffled but still audible, preaching about the blessings of suffering and the necessity of pain for spiritual growth. The irony was not lost on her. Tonight, he would learn about suffering. Tonight, he would discover what pain truly meant. The main entrance required more care because it faced the plantation grounds and could potentially be seen by someone passing by. Dinah waited until she heard the congregation begin singing a hymn. their voices covering any small sounds she might make, then quickly wrapped the heavy chain around the double door handles. This chain was the longest and strongest, designed to hold against multiple people pushing from inside. She secured it with 2 locks instead of 1, then tested it by pulling hard. The doors did not budge. Perfect. 3 exits sealed. Everyone trapped inside. Now came the most dangerous part. Dinah moved around the chapel to the window she had left unlocked for herself, the one hidden behind bushes on the south side. She opened it carefully, climbing through into the storage room, where lamp oil and candles and other supplies were kept. She could hear the service continuing on the other side of the wall, Magnolia's organ and the congregation's voices creating a soundtrack for what came next. She gathered the remaining bottles of lamp oil, 6 in total, and began her work. She moved through the storage room first, pouring oil onto wooden shelves and floor, soaking everything flammable. Then she crept to the door that led into the main chapel space, opening it just enough to slip through, staying low and in shadows. Thanking God or ancestors or whatever forces might be watching that the chapel was dimly lit by candles and that everyone's attention focused on the reverend at the altar. Dinah crawled along the back wall, staying behind the last row of pews, pouring oil onto the floor and walls as she moved. She emptied 2 bottles this way, creating a path of accelerant that would ensure the fire spread quickly once lit. She could see the congregation from her position, could see the backs of freed people's heads, could see the white men in their fine clothes sitting in positions of honor, could see Whitfield gesturing dramatically as he preached, could see Magnolia at the organ, her fingers dancing across the keys. The basement came next. Dinah crawled to the front of the chapel, moving with agonizing slowness, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might be audible. She reached the altar area and slipped behind the velvet curtain that concealed the trapdoor. From here, she could hear everything clearly. Whitfield's voice, Magnolia's organ, the congregation's responses, even individual coughs and shifting bodies. She was so close to them now, close enough to strike. She pulled the trapdoor open slowly, wincing at every small creak, praying that the organ music and singing would cover the sound. Once open, she descended halfway down the stairs and poured oil onto every surface she could reach without fully entering that cursed place. She soaked the stairs themselves, the walls, the door frames of the 6 rooms. When she ran out of oil, she climbed back up, pulled the heavy wooden beam across the trapdoor and dropped it into the iron brackets with a soft thud that made her freeze in terror. But no one had heard. The service continued. Whitfield was building to his conclusion now, his voice rising in manufactured passion as he spoke about the coming kingdom and the need for all people to know their place in God's divine order. "And on that great day of judgment," he thundered, "every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The righteous shall be separated from the wicked, the wheat from the chaff, the saved from the damned. And those who have lived in obedience and submission shall inherit eternal glory, while those who rebelled and resisted shall face eternal torment in lakes of fire." Dinah smiled grimly at the irony. Tonight, Reverend Whitfield would discover which category he belonged to. She had 1 bottle of oil remaining. She used it to create a final path from the altar to the rear door, connecting all her previous work into one continuous trail. Then she retreated to the storage room, climbing back out through the unlocked window, carefully closing it behind her. She stood outside in darkness, breathing hard, checking her mental list of preparations, exits chained, building soaked with oil, basement sealed, all white men present and accounted for, all preparations complete. Now came the fire. Dinah had gathered kindling and built small piles of it against the chapel's walls weeks ago, disguising them as decoration or cleaning debris, making them invisible to anyone who might notice. Now she lit the first pile with matches she had stolen from the big house kitchen, watching flames catch and spread, touching oil-soaked wood and racing up the wall with hungry speed. She moved to the second pile, the third, the fourth, working her way around the building, creating multiple ignition points, ensuring the fire would surround the chapel completely. Smoke began to rise almost immediately, thin wisps at first, then thicker clouds as the fire found fuel and grew. Dinah completed her circuit of the building, lighting the final kindling pile near the main entrance, then stepped back to watch her work. Flames climbed the white walls, orange and red and yellow against the darkness, beautiful and terrible. The fire spread with shocking speed, racing along oil trails, consuming dry pine wood that had stood for 26 years, waiting for this moment. Inside the chapel, someone shouted, then someone screamed. Then multiple voices rose in panic and confusion as smoke began to seep through cracks in the walls, and people realized something was terribly wrong. Dinah heard them clearly. "Fire! We have to get out! The doors! They won't open! We're trapped!" The panic escalated rapidly from confusion to terror, voices overlapping in chaos, feet running toward exits, hands pounding on doors that would not open. Dutch McLean's voice boomed above the others. "The chains! Someone chained the fucking doors!" James Pike screamed for axes. Benjamin Stone shouted about the windows. Thomas Root simply screamed. Reverend Whitfield's authoritative preacher's voice cracked into something high and desperate. "Remain calm. God will provide." But God was not providing. God, if he existed, had abandoned Sacred Heart Chapel to the justice of fire. Dinah walked calmly to the main entrance and stood directly in front of the chained doors, close enough to feel heat beginning to build, close enough to hear every word spoken inside. The wood was already beginning to char, smoke pouring through gaps, flames visible through cracks. She heard bodies slam against the doors, heard the chains rattle and hold, heard men curse and women scream, and something that might have been prayer or might have been madness. Then Reverend Whitfield's voice, closer now, just on the other side of the door. "Who's out there? Help us! For the love of God, help us!" Dinah pressed her face close to the door and spoke clearly, loudly, making sure he heard every word. "There is no help coming, Reverend. Not for you, not for any of you." Silence on the other side, shocked and absolute. Then, "Dinah? Is that you? What have you done?" She laughed, a sound without humor or mercy. "What have I done? I've brought you justice, Reverend. I've sent you to the judgment you've been preaching about. Open these doors immediately." Magnolia's voice now, shrill with panic and outrage. "You'll hang for this. They'll burn you alive." Dinah's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Maybe they will, mistress, but you won't be there to see it. You'll be dead. All of you will be dead. You destroyed my daughter. You destroyed dozens of girls. You built a house of rape and called it a house of God. Tonight, God has sent me to cleanse it." Judge Webb's voice. "There are innocent people in here. Women, good Christian women." Dinah's laugh was genuinely amused. "Innocent? Magnolia selected the girls. She dressed them. She delivered them to be raped. She kept the records. She took the money. There are no innocent people in that chapel, Judge. Only monsters and the people who serve them." She heard them trying desperately to break through the chains, multiple men pulling together, their efforts useless against Samuel's ironwork. The smoke was thicker now, pouring under the doors, and Dinah heard coughing fits beginning inside, heard voices becoming raspy and desperate. Someone tried to break through a window and discovered the wedges, discovered the furniture blocking the way, discovered that every possible escape had been anticipated and prevented. "The basement!" someone shouted. "We can hide in the basement until help comes." Dinah heard footsteps running toward the altar, heard someone try to lift the trap door, heard the confused shouts when they realized it was barred from above. "It's locked! The basement is locked!" Panic was complete now. Voices screaming over each other, the sound of mass terror contained and helpless. Dinah listened to it with satisfaction, so deep it felt almost sexual. This was power. This was justice. This was what they deserved. The fire had engulfed the entire exterior now, flames reaching 20 feet high, heat so intense that Dinah had to step back to avoid being burned herself. The chapel glowed orange and red, light pulsing through cracks and gaps, transforming the building into a massive lantern visible for miles. She could see figures moving inside through the gaps, shadows dancing frantically, people running from corner to corner, searching for escape that did not exist. A new sound joined the screaming, the sound of the building itself dying. Support beams began to crack and groan, wood splitting under extreme heat, structural integrity failing. The steeple caught fire and blazed like a torch, flames shooting into the night sky, visible from St. Martinville 3 miles away. Burning shingles began to fall from the roof onto the people trapped inside, setting clothes and hair on fire, adding individual blazes to the general inferno. Dinah heard Dr. Finch screaming about his medical bag, about instruments that could cut through chains, about some escape he could engineer if only he had tools. She heard him try and heard him fail and heard him start to burn. She heard Merchant Landry praying in French, his native language emerging in extremis, begging God for mercy he had never shown to the children he had raped. She heard Captain Morrison trying to organize the freed people to fight the fire with their bodies, his military training useless against flames that respected no rank or uniform. The overseers died with less dignity than the others. Dutch McLean threw himself against the main door repeatedly, his massive body slamming into wood and chain, roaring with rage and pain, refusing to accept that he was beaten. James Pike tried to climb up to the high windows, stepping on other people's backs and shoulders in his desperation, only to fall into flames when his perch collapsed. Benjamin Stone simply curled into a ball and screamed, his analytical mind unable to process his own destruction, his journals burning with him. Thomas Root did exactly what Dinah had predicted. He ran from corner to corner like a trapped rat, crying for his mother, dying without ever showing a moment of courage. The 2 slave traders tried to negotiate. Jessup called out to Dinah, offering money, offering to leave Louisiana and never return, offering anything if she would just open the doors. Barnaby tried threats, shouting that their partners would hunt her down, that she would die slow for this, that her suffering would be legendary. Dinah ignored both of them. They were beyond negotiation and beyond threat. They were simply fuel for the fire now, their lives measured in minutes rather than years. Reverend Whitfield's voice rose above the chaos one final time, not begging now, but condemning, finding in his final moments the authoritative tone that had cowed congregations for decades. You will burn in hell for this, Dinah. God sees what you have done. God knows your sin. You have murdered innocent people. Dinah laughed loudly enough for him to hear. Innocent? You raped my daughter. You raped dozens of daughters. You built a torture chamber under your altar and called it ministry. If I'm going to hell, Reverend, at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing you got there first. The roof collapsed at 9:47. 17 minutes after the first flames were lit. Dinah heard it go, heard the massive crash as burning timbers fell onto the people below, heard the screams intensify briefly, then begin to fade as smoke and heat overwhelmed lungs and hearts and brains. The temperature inside the chapel had exceeded 1,000 degrees now, hot enough to melt brass candlesticks, hot enough to turn human bodies into fuel, hot enough to make death mercifully quick for those still conscious to experience it. Magnolia's voice was one of the last Dinah heard, the mistress calling out not for God or help, but for her mother, regressing to childhood in her final moments, crying, "Mama, mama, mama," as the fire consumed her. Then she was silent. Then they were all silent, except for the roar of flames and the groan of dying structure. The chapel had become a crematorium, and everyone inside was ash. Dinah stood watching until the walls began to collapse inward, until the building was no longer a structure, but simply a pile of burning rubble, until she was certain that no one could have survived. Only then did she turn and walk back toward the quarters, her face illuminated by firelight, her dress covered in ash, her hands steady and her conscience clear. She found Samuel and Rose waiting outside their cabin, both of them staring at the massive fire that lit up the night sky. Rose looked at her mother with wide eyes and whispered, "What did you do, Mama?" Dinah pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace and said, "I kept my promise, baby. No one will ever hurt you again." Rose began to cry, great shaking sobs that seemed to release 2 years of agony, and Dinah held her and rocked her and let her cry. Samuel put his arms around both of them, sheltering his family in the circle of his strength, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. They stood like that for a long time. 3 people who had survived the unsurvivable, bound together by blood and love and shared trauma, watching the chapel burn down to embers and ash. Other freed people began to emerge from their cabins, drawn by the light and heat and smell of burning wood and burning flesh. They gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, looking between the fire and Dinah with expressions that mixed horror and understanding and something that might have been gratitude. No one tried to fight the fire, no one called for help. They simply watched it burn and understood that something had fundamentally changed at Sacred Heart Plantation. Mama Bessie approached Dinah alone, the old conjure woman moving slowly on arthritic legs, her face serene and knowing. She placed one weathered hand on Dinah's shoulder and said quietly, "The Loa are satisfied, child. Your ancestors claim you. You have done what needed doing." Then she pressed something into Dinah's palm, a small cloth bag, a protective gree-gree for the journey ahead. "You'll need to run now. They'll come for you at dawn. But you'll run free, and that matters." Dinah nodded, closing her fingers around the bag, accepting the old woman's blessing and her warning. As the fire burned lower and the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Dinah made her decision. She would not run. She had never intended to run. Running would suggest guilt, would suggest she had done something wrong, would suggest she needed to hide from judgment. But Dinah felt no guilt. She had done what justice required when the law offered no protection and God seemed deaf to prayers. She had stopped monsters who would have continued their evil indefinitely. She had saved future daughters from the basement. She had sent a message that could not be ignored or explained away. When the authorities came, she would be ready. She would tell them exactly what she had done and exactly why. She would force them to confront the evil that had flourished under their noses, the rape of children disguised as religious instruction, the systematic torture hidden behind white walls and stained glass. She would make them acknowledge it publicly, make them write it in official records, make them admit that what happened at Sacred Heart Chapel was not isolated, but institutional, not aberration, but tradition. And if they hanged her for it, so be it. She would die having achieved something no amount of patience or faith or hope had accomplished. She had ended the suffering. She had closed the basement forever. She had made sure those particular monsters would never hurt another child. That was worth her life. That was worth whatever came next. Dawn broke fully at 6:17, revealing the complete destruction of Sacred Heart Chapel. Nothing remained but a foundation of blackened stone and piles of ash that had once been wood and pews and people. The stench of burned flesh hung heavy in the air, unmistakable and terrible. The steeple had fallen across the remains of the building like a fallen cross, a perfect symbol of faith corrupted and destroyed. At 7 o'clock, a rider from a neighboring plantation arrived to investigate the smoke he had seen during the night. He found the ruins and rode immediately to St. Martinville to alert the sheriff. By 9 o'clock, Sheriff William Tate's deputy, the sheriff himself was among the dead, had arrived with a dozen armed men, expecting to find chaos and confusion. Instead, they found the freed people of Sacred Heart gathered quietly in front of their quarters, waiting with dignified silence, with Dinah standing at the front of the group, her hands folded calmly, her expression peaceful. The deputy, a young man named Marcus Webb, who happened to be Judge Webb's nephew, looked at the scene with growing horror. "What happened here? Where is Reverend Whitfield? Where are the overseers?" Dinah stepped forward and said clearly, so everyone could hear, "They are dead. I killed them. I burned the chapel with 23 people inside because they were raping children in the basement and calling it Christian ministry. If you want to arrest someone, arrest me. I did it. I would do it again." The deputy stared at her in shock, his young face struggling to process what he was hearing. You murdered 23 people?" Dinah's voice remained steady and clear. "I executed 23 rapists and their accomplices. There is a difference. In that basement, you will find 6 rooms where girls were kept and violated. In Reverend Whitfield's study, you will find journals documenting years of abuse. In the chapel office, you will find Magnolia Whitfield's ledger listing clients and payments. The evidence is there if you have the courage to look." Marcus Webb did not want to look. He wanted to arrest Dinah immediately and restore order and pretend this was simple murder rather than complicated justice. But Dinah had spoken loudly and publicly, and the freed people were witnesses, and word was already spreading through the parish. He could not simply disappear her. He had to investigate, had to examine the evidence, had to document what had happened before taking action. And that meant entering the ruins and seeing what lay beneath. The search of the burned chapel took 3 hours and revealed horrors that made hardened men vomit. The basement had survived the fire largely intact, protected by earth and stone. And inside those 6 small rooms, the investigators found exactly what Dinah had described. Narrow beds with restraints bolted to the frames, Bibles open to passages about obedience and submission, stains that told their own terrible story. In Reverend Whitfield's study, which had been separate from the chapel and thus survived the fire, they found journals spanning 22 years detailing systematic sexual abuse of enslaved girls, complete with dates and names and descriptions so explicit that the men reading them felt contaminated by the knowledge. Most damning of all was Magnolia Whitfield's ledger, discovered hidden behind a loose board exactly where Dinah said it would be. The ledger listed 14 regular clients by name: Judge Harrison Webb, Dr. Samuel Finch, Merchant Robert Landry, Captain Edward Morrison, Pastor John Hebert, Lawyer Daniel Cross, Sheriff William Tate, Banker George Hammond, and 6 others, all prominent men, all respected in the community, all dead in the fire. The ledger showed payments received, dates of visits, even notes about which girls each man preferred. It was a business record of rape, documented with the same attention to detail as any other commercial enterprise. The revelation shook St. Martin Parish to its core. These were not marginal men or known criminals, but pillars of the community. Men who sat in positions of authority and judgment, men whose families had helped found the parish, men who preached about morality and law and Christian values while systematically destroying black children. The cognitive dissonance was too great for some people to accept. They insisted the evidence was fabricated, that Dinah had created false records to justify her crime, that good Christian men could not possibly have done such things. But the evidence was overwhelming and public. The deputy had witnesses to the discovery, including 2 white landowners from neighboring plantations who had accompanied the search party. The journals were in Reverend Whitfield's own handwriting, confirmed by comparing to his sermons and correspondence. The ledger matched payments to deposits in the chapel's account books. The basement rooms existed and contained exactly what Dinah had described. Denial was possible, but required deliberate blindness to documented truth. Dinah was arrested on June 8th and taken to the parish jail in St. Martinville, where she was held in a cell while authorities decided what to do with her. Louisiana law was clear that murder was a capital crime, but the circumstances were unprecedented. The victims included a sheriff, a judge, and a Union Army captain, which meant the case drew attention from state and federal authorities. Reconstruction officials arrived to investigate, abolitionist newspapers sent reporters to cover the story, and suddenly Sacred Heart Plantation was infamous throughout the South. The trial, such as it was, took place 3 weeks later in a makeshift courtroom, as the regular courthouse was too small to accommodate the crowds. Dinah was charged with 23 counts of murder. She pleaded guilty to all charges and refused legal representation, choosing instead to represent herself. When given the opportunity to speak, she stood before the all-white jury and the white judge and the packed courtroom of white spectators and told her story with calm precision. She described Rose's first trip to the basement in April of 1865. She described the 2 years of systematic rape that followed. She described watching her daughter try to kill herself rather than endure another Wednesday night. She described the other girls, naming them one by one: Chloe, Louisa, Betty, Sarah, Dinah, Harriet, Rose, Mary, and more, forcing the courtroom to hear their names and acknowledge their humanity. She described the evidence she had found and the preparations she had made and the execution she had carried out. "I do not ask for mercy," she concluded. "I do not ask for understanding. I ask only that you acknowledge what happened in that basement, that you write it in your official records, that you admit these men were monsters regardless of their skin color or social position. I killed them because the law would not. I killed them because no one else would. I killed them because they were destroying children and calling it God's work. If you hang me for that, I will die satisfied knowing I did what was right." The jury deliberated for 17 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 23 counts. The judge sentenced Dinah to death by hanging, the sentence to be carried out on July 15, 1867. Dinah accepted the verdict without emotion, bowing her head briefly in acknowledgement, then being led back to her cell to await execution. The remaining 5 weeks of Dinah's life became a strange kind of triumph. Abolitionist newspapers published her full testimony, spreading her story throughout the North and drawing attention to the ongoing sexual exploitation of black women and girls in the South, despite slavery's official end. A Northern Missionary Society paid for Rose and Samuel to relocate to Massachusetts, where Rose could receive care and begin healing in safety. Letters arrived at the jail from across the country, some condemning Dinah as a murderer, but many others praising her courage and calling her a hero. Dinah spent her final weeks in surprising peace. She wrote letters to Rose, telling her daughter to live fully and freely, to find joy where she could, to never let anyone make her feel less than human. She wrote letters to Samuel, thanking him for 14 years of partnership and love, releasing him from any obligation to grieve forever. She spoke with journalists who made the journey to St. Martinville, ensuring her story would be preserved in detail. She met with Mama Bessie one final time, receiving the old woman's blessing and her assurance that ancestors would welcome Dinah as a warrior returning home. On the morning of July 15th, Dinah walked to the gallows in front of the courthouse, with her head high and her step steady. A crowd of over 1,000 people had gathered, some to jeer, many to mourn, all to witness. Dinah wore a simple white dress that Rose had sewn for her and a red chignon wrapped around her hair. She refused a hood, choosing to face death with open eyes. When offered the opportunity for final words, she spoke loudly and clearly. "I am Dinah, daughter of Ayana, granddaughter of Zola, descended from warriors who never surrendered. I killed 23 people who raped children and built a torture chamber under an altar. I do not regret it. I would do it again. To the girls who survived Sacred Heart and all the other places like it, You are not damaged. You are not dirty. You are beloved daughters of Africa, and you deserve freedom and peace and joy. To those who would continue what those men started, we are watching. We will not forget. We will not forgive, and someday someone will make you pay. Freedom or death. I choose death with honor over life with shame. The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Dinah closed her eyes and thought of Rose safe in Massachusetts, of Samuel starting a new life, of all the girls who would never suffer in that basement because it no longer existed. She thought of her ancestors and her daughter and her own fierce heart that had refused to break even when breaking seemed easier than fighting. She thought about justice and vengeance and the fine line between them, about systems of oppression and individual acts of resistance, about the price of dignity in an undignified world. The trapdoor opened at 10:17 on July 15th, 1867. Dinah fell. Her neck broke instantly. She died having achieved what she set out to do, ending the suffering, protecting her child, sending monsters to judgment. She died free in the only way that mattered, with her choices her own, her conscience clear, her dignity intact. She died as she had lived the last 2 years of her life, as a weapon, a warrior, a mother who loved so fiercely that she was willing to become a killer to keep her daughter safe. The impact of Dinah's act extended far beyond Sacred Heart Plantation. The exposure of the basement ministry and the identities of the men involved sent shockwaves through southern Louisiana society. 7 families of the dead clients left the parish in disgrace. 3 other plantations were investigated after freed people came forward with similar allegations, leading to arrests and trials. The scandal contributed to increased federal oversight during Reconstruction and emboldened other victims to speak publicly about abuses that had previously been hidden. Sacred Heart Plantation was seized by federal authorities and divided among the freed people who had worked it, one of the few successful land redistributions during Reconstruction. The site where the chapel stood was left as ruins, never rebuilt, becoming a memorial to the girls who had suffered there and to the woman who had avenged them. For decades afterward, people would visit the ruins and leave flowers, particularly on June 7th, the anniversary of the fire. Dinah's story spread through the network of freed people across the South, told in whispers and songs and stories passed from generation to generation. She became a figure of folklore, a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most powerless person might still find a way to strike back against injustice. Spirituals emerged that encoded her story. Dinah built a fire, let it burn, let it burn. 23 went down to hell, never to return. Mama saved her daughter, though the price was high. Better to die standing up than to live on your knees. Rose survived and eventually thrived, though she carried scars that never fully healed. She lived to age 73, married a freedman named Joshua Turner, had 5 children, and became a teacher and activist for women's rights and racial justice. She spoke publicly about her mother only once, in an interview for a northern newspaper in 1903. "My mother saved my life by taking 23 others. People ask if I think she was a murderer or a hero. She was both. She was neither. She was a mother who did what mothers do. She protected her child. The world called it murder. I call it love." Samuel remarried in 1871 to a woman named Clara, who had also survived slavery. They had 3 children together and ran a successful blacksmith shop in Boston, where Samuel became known for refusing to forge chains or shackles of any kind, only tools of construction and creation. He lived to age 68 and was buried with a small cloth bag around his neck containing a lock of Dinah's hair and a piece of charred wood from Sacred Heart Chapel. The basement at Sacred Heart was excavated in 1937 by historians documenting slavery and Reconstruction. They found the 6 rooms exactly as described in trial records, along with artifacts that confirmed the testimony: restraints, Bibles, personal items belonging to the girls. The site was designated a historical landmark, though local resistance prevented more visible commemoration until 1974, when a memorial was finally erected listing the names of the known victims and bearing Dinah's final words: freedom or death. Looking back at Dinah's act from our current moment, we face difficult questions about justice and vengeance, about the morality of violence in response to violence, about what we owe to victims when systems fail to protect them. Dinah murdered 23 people, including some who were arguably less culpable than others. The slave traders perhaps deserved their fate more than the clients more than Magnolia, though all participated in systematic rape. She killed without trial, without due process, without offering her victims any chance to repent or reform. By any legal definition, she was a mass murderer. And yet, what options did she have? The law offered no protection to freed people in 1867 Louisiana, particularly not against prominent white men. Reporting the abuse would have accomplished nothing except punishment for the reporter. The federal government was overwhelmed trying to manage Reconstruction across the entire South and could not prevent every local atrocity. The church was complicit. Reverend Whitfield was the church. The community was complicit. The clients were the community leaders. Dinah had no legal recourse, no institutional support, no peaceful path to justice. She could have done nothing, accepting Rose's suffering as just another unavoidable tragedy in a world full of them. She could have helped Rose escape via the Underground Railroad, saving one daughter while leaving the system intact to destroy others. She could have killed only Reverend Whitfield, targeting the head of the operation while leaving accomplices unpunished. Instead, she chose total destruction, absolute justice, the complete dismantling of an evil system through the only means available to her: fire and death. History struggles to categorize people like Dinah. She does not fit easily into boxes labeled hero or villain, freedom fighter or terrorist, justified or criminal. She exists in the complicated space between them, a person driven to extraordinary violence by extraordinary circumstances, a mother who became a killer because killing was the only protection available. We can acknowledge the horror of what she did while understanding why she did it. We can condemn mass murder while recognizing that some systems are so evil that their destruction justifies extreme measures. What Dinah teaches us is uncomfortable: that oppression pushed far enough creates violence, that systems that offer no justice inevitably produce revenge, that people stripped of legal recourse will create their own. She teaches us that evil flourishes when good people do nothing, but also when institutions designed to prevent evil instead protect it. She teaches us that sometimes the greatest love looks like the greatest hate, that maternal protection can manifest as murderous rage, that the line between righteousness and wickedness is drawn differently depending on whose child is being destroyed. Sacred Heart Chapel burned on June 7, 1867. 23 people died. One woman chose death over submission and became immortal in the process. The basement was closed forever. Future daughters were saved. Justice, however rough and terrible, was done. Whether that justice justified its cost is a question each person must answer for themselves. Dinah answered it in fire and chains and absolute conviction. History records her answer and leaves us to determine our own. If you feel anger hearing this story, you should. If you feel horror, that is appropriate. If you feel conflict between condemning murder and understanding why it happened, you are paying attention. These are not simple stories with simple lessons. They are complicated truths about complicated times, about what humans become when pushed beyond endurance, about the terrible things love can drive us to do. What happened at Sacred Heart happened in America, on American soil, under American law, to American citizens. It was not ancient history or foreign atrocity, but domestic evil, woven into the fabric of our country's foundation, protected by institutions we still claim to revere. The chapel burned 157 years ago, but the systems that enabled it, racism, sexual exploitation of vulnerable people, institutional protection of powerful predators, remain alive today in different forms. The fight Dinah fought is not finished. The vigilance she demanded is still required. Remember Dinah. Remember Rose. Remember the girls whose names we know and the countless others whose names were never recorded. Remember that silence protects abusers, that complicity enables evil, that systems change only when forced to change. Remember that the powerless sometimes find power, that the voiceless sometimes scream loud enough to be heard, that justice delayed indefinitely is eventually justice taken into desperate hands. Remember Sacred Heart Chapel, its white walls hiding a basement of horrors, its steeple pointing toward heaven while hell operated in the foundation. Remember how it burned, how quickly righteous fire consumed 26 years of accumulated sin, how completely destruction can come when patience finally ends. Remember that sometimes the only way to cleanse a cursed place is to burn it entirely to the ground. And remember that in 1867, a woman named Dinah decided that her daughter's life and dignity and future mattered more than her own survival. More than law, more than anything except justice. She acted on that decision with absolute commitment and paid the ultimate price without regret. Whether that makes her a hero, a villain, or something more complicated than either, history records her choice and challenges us to examine our own. What would we do? How far would we go? What price would we pay to protect those we love from those who mean them harm? These are not abstract questions. They are asked and answered every day by people facing impossible choices in unjust systems. Dinah's answer was fire. What is yours?